The fluorescent lights hummed an unrelenting monotone against the drop ceiling of the Harrison Financial Annex. James stared at the spreadsheet, the numbers blurring into a gray smear of data. The phone on his desk vibrated, a harsh plastic rattle against the faux wood grain. The caller ID flashed the crest of Chicago Memorial Hospital. His chest tightened, a familiar cold dread pooling in his stomach. He picked up the receiver, the air in the room suddenly feeling too thin to breathe. "Mr. Sterling, calling regarding Sarah's pre-admission." The voice on the other end possessed the sterile, practiced empathy of a billing coordinator. "The surgical date has been moved up. Dr. Aris wants to proceed next Thursday. We need to verify the continued active status of your premium tier coverage." "The coverage is active." His voice remained steady, a practiced anchor in a storm of internal panic. "Tier 1. Employee-sponsored. Excellent. The out-of-pocket for the revised valve procedure will exceed $70,000 without it, as long as your employment status remains unchanged through the recovery period. The policy covers the entirety of the operation." The line clicked dead. James set the receiver down, his large hands trembling slightly before he forced them into tight fists. $70,000. The number echoed in the silent cubicle, a phantom weight threatening to crush the breath from his lungs. He reached for the worn leather wallet in his breast pocket, extracting a small, slightly creased photograph. Sarah. 7 years old, a gap-toothed smile radiating pure, unadulterated light, her small hands clutching a stethoscope to a stuffed bear's chest. Behind her, the blurred, beautiful ghost of Elena, captured just months before the cancer took her. He pressed his thumb against the glossy paper, the only physical tether to the woman who had taught him how to fight. The stakes were no longer abstract. The premium health insurance provided by Harrison Financial was the literal lifeblood keeping Sarah's fragile heart beating. Losing this job was not a setback, it was a death sentence. He straightened his tie, the cheap silk a rough reminder of the gap between his reality and the world he navigated daily. Tonight was the annual executive mixer. Attendance was unspoken but mandatory for anyone looking to secure their position. He needed to be visible. He needed to be impeccable. The skyline of Chicago bruised purple as dusk settled over the frozen lake. The venue was a glass-walled penthouse overlooking the magnificent Mile, a cathedral of wealth where the air smelled of aged scotch and strategic alliances. James stepped off the elevator, immediately adjusting his posture. Back straight, expression neutral, the mask of the competent, invisible analyst firmly in place. He was a black man in a sea of tailored European suits. A widower carrying the weight of a sick child in a room where the biggest tragedy was a volatile stock portfolio. Waitresses floated through the crowd carrying silver trays of champagne. James took a glass of sparkling water, moving to the periphery of the room. He observed the ecosystem. The sycophants hovered near the corner windows, their laughter a fraction too loud, their smiles a fraction too wide. And at the center of the gravitational pull stood Victoria. The chief executive officer wore a tailored suit the color of crushed slate, her blonde hair pulled back in a severe twist. She held a crystal tumbler like a weapon, her eyes scanning the room with a calculating coldness that kept the wolves at bay. But James noticed the minute tremors in her fingers. He saw the way she drained the glass and immediately signaled for another. The armor was cracking. Rumors had been bleeding through the corporate walls for weeks. A vicious, scorched earth divorce from William, a managing partner who currently sat on the board of directors. A man whose cruelty was matched only by his ambition. William wanted the company. He wanted to break her to get it. James checked his watch. 8:15. He had promised Sarah he would FaceTime her before Martha tucked her in. He stared at the glowing screen of his phone, the lock screen image of his daughter, a stark reminder of his true priorities. He needed to shake 3 more hands, make brief eye contact with 2 directors, and then he could vanish into the freezing night. A sudden sharp sound cut through the ambient jazz, a glass shattering. The room went silent for a heartbeat. James turned toward the bar. Victoria was leaning heavily against the polished mahogany counter, her face flushed, a broken martini glass at her feet. The bartender moved quickly with a towel, his eyes darting away in embarrassment. The crowd, sensing weakness, immediately engaged in a collective, synchronized pivot. They turned their backs. The murmurs resumed, but the frequency had changed. It was the sound of vultures circling. She pushed off the bar, her heels catching on the thick carpet. She stumbled, catching herself against a high-top table. A managing director nearby took a deliberate step to the left, pretending to admire the skyline, entirely ignoring the CEO struggling to stand upright. James watched from the shadows of a marble pillar. The unwritten rules of corporate survival screamed at him to walk away. A black man approaching a heavily intoxicated white female executive in a public setting was a recipe for career suicide. Optics were everything. The narrative could be twisted, weaponized, used to strip him of his livelihood. The $70,000 surgery flashed in his mind, the hum of the hospital monitors. Leave her. Let someone else handle the fallout. But nobody was moving. The executives, the people who praised her leadership and cashed the bonuses she generated, were content to let her drown. Victoria lurched toward the coat check, her movements erratic, desperate. She dug into her designer purse, pulling out a phone. She stared at the screen, her thumbs clumsy. Suddenly, with a ragged, breathy sob, she slammed the phone against the marble wall. The glass screen spiderwebbed, the device dropping to the floor, dead. She was completely untethered. No phone, no allies, entirely vulnerable in a city that ate the weak. James felt the heavy anchor of his own conscience dragging against his survival instincts. A memory surfaced, sharp and unyielding, Elena holding his face in her hands, her voice weak but fierce. A man is what he does when it costs him something. He set his water glass down. I have dignity. I deserve respect. And because I demand it for myself, I cannot strip it from another human being by watching them fall. He crossed the room, his stride purposeful, cutting through the invisible barrier the crowd had erected around the falling executive. He stopped 2 feet away from her, keeping his hands visible, his voice pitched low, an island of calm in her spiraling panic. Victoria, it's James from Risk Analysis. I am going to call a car and I am going to get you out of here. She looked up, her eyes unfocused, mascara smudging the sharp lines of her cheekbones. She swayed, reaching out blindly. I can't. The address. I don't know the new address. He took the house. William took. Her voice was rising, drawing the sidelong glances of the junior partners. Lower your voice. He kept his tone firm, entirely devoid of threat. We are walking to the elevator. Keep your eyes on the doors. He did not touch her. He stepped beside her, using his broad shoulders to block the view of the nearest cluster of gossiping managers. He guided her through the lobby, the descent in the elevator a tense silence broken only by her ragged breathing. The cold Chicago air hit them like a physical blow as they exited the building. The valet brought James's 10-year-old sedan around. He opened the passenger door, waiting as she fumbled her way into the seat, her head immediately falling back against the headrest. He climbed into the driver's seat, starting the engine. The heater blasted, fighting the winter chill. He looked at the shattered phone in her lap. She had no address. She was in no condition to be left at a hotel, not with the sharks waiting for a scandal. His phone buzzed on the dashboard mount. A FaceTime request, Martha. James squeezed his eyes shut. It was 8:40. Sarah's bedtime. He looked at the woman passed out in the passenger seat. If he answered, Sarah would see the interior of the car, would ask questions, would sense the tension. If he didn't answer, she would go to sleep disappointed. He hit decline. He typed a rapid text. Work emergency. Tell my brave girl I love her. I will see her in the morning. The guilt tasted like ash in his mouth. He put the car in gear, the headlights sweeping across the frozen asphalt. The destination was not a choice. It was the only option left. He steered the car south, away from the penthouses and the wealth, toward the modest, working-class neighborhood where reality was measured in mortgage payments and medical bills. The drive took 30 minutes. Victoria drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering fragmented, terrified pleas to people who weren't there. James kept his eyes strictly on the road, the dashcam mounted behind his rearview mirror blinking its steady red recording light. He noted the time, the route, the absolute necessity of maintaining a sterile environment. Intent doesn't erase impact. He knew how the world would view this if it went wrong. He pulled into the narrow driveway of his single-story brick home. The porch light flickered, illuminating the slightly overgrown hydrangeas Elena had planted years ago. He cut the engine. "Victoria, we are here. You need to walk." He opened her door. She stumbled out, the cold night air momentarily reviving her. She leaned heavily against the side of the car, her designer heels sinking into a patch of snow. James did not offer his arm, mindful of the neighbor's dark windows. He walked ahead, unlocking the front door, disarming the security system with a rapid sequence of beeps. He stepped aside, allowing her to enter. The living room was small, dominated by a worn corduroy sofa and a coffee table covered in crayons and half-finished coloring books. The air smelled of cinnamon and laundry detergent, a stark contrast to the sterile opulence of the penthouse they had just fled. Victoria collapsed onto the sofa, curling into a tight, defensive ball, her coat still wrapped tightly around her. She was shivering, not from the cold but from a deeper, systemic shock. James stood in the entryway, the weight of the situation fully settling on his shoulders. He had crossed a Rubicon. He walked to the hallway closet, pulling out a heavy wool blanket. He draped it over her, his movements clinical, detached. He then walked to his bedroom, opening a drawer and retrieving a clean, oversized gray sweatshirt and a pair of unworn sweatpants. He placed them neatly on the armchair across from the sofa. He went to the kitchen, filling a glass with water and setting it on a coaster on the coffee table alongside 2 aspirin. He pulled a notepad from the counter, clicking a pen. He needed to establish boundaries, clear and unambiguous. "Victoria, you were intoxicated and stranded at the party. Your phone was broken. You could not provide an address. For your safety, I brought you to my home. I have left clean clothes here. I am sleeping in my daughter's room down the hall. If you need anything, knock. James." He placed the note directly beside the water glass, propping it against a crayon box so she could not miss it upon waking. He checked the locks on the front door, turned off the overhead lights, leaving only a small, warm amber reading lamp glowing in the corner. He walked quietly down the narrow hallway, pausing at the cracked door of Sarah's room. He pushed it open. A small nightlight cast dancing stars across the ceiling. Sarah was asleep, her breathing shallow but steady, her small chest rising and falling beneath a quilt patterned with cartoon animals. A stuffed bear rested under her chin. James sank to the carpeted floor beside her bed, his back resting against the wall. The exhaustion hit him like a physical blow. He pulled his knees to his chest, resting his forehead on his arms. He had missed her bedtime. He had prioritized the safety of a woman who barely knew his name over the ritual that anchored his daughter's world. But he knew, with the unshakable clarity of a man who lived by a rigid moral code, that he had done the only thing he could. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision that something else is more important. He had protected a vulnerable human being. He just prayed the cost would not be his daughter's life. He closed his eyes, the hard floor offering no comfort, the silence of the house broken only by the rhythmic hum of the refrigerator and the shallow breathing of the sick child he loved more than his own life. The gray light of a Chicago winter morning crept through the living room blinds, casting long, pale shadows across the floorboards. Victoria woke with a gasp, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her head throbbed, a vicious, pulsing ache that blurred her vision. She pushed herself up on the unfamiliar corduroy sofa, the heavy wool blanket falling to the floor. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded her veins. She looked down. She was still wearing the slate suit, though it was hopelessly wrinkled, the silk blouse stained. She scanned the room, crayons, a television, a worn rug. This was not her penthouse. This was not a hotel. The events of the previous night were a jagged, shattered mirror in her mind. The party, the alcohol burning her throat, the terrifying realization that William had frozen her primary accounts. The panic attack. And then, nothing. A void of memory, dark and complete. She scrambled to her feet, her breath coming in short, hyperventilating gasps. She patted her pockets, her hands trembling violently. Her phone. She remembered smashing it. She looked at the coffee table, her eyes darting past the neatly folded clothes and the glass of water, landing on the small landline phone sitting on an end table. She lunged for it, knocking a box of crayons to the floor. She picked up the receiver, her fingers clumsy on the dial pad. She punched in a number from pure muscle memory. Claire, her attorney, her only remaining ally. The line rang twice before a sharp voice answered. "Victoria, where the hell are you? I've been trying to reach you all night." "Claire." Victoria's voice was a ragged whisper choked with absolute terror. "Claire, I need help. I don't know where I am." Down the hallway, James stood frozen. He had been awake for hours, quietly preparing oatmeal in the kitchen, careful not to make a sound. Now he stood in the shadow of the corridor, perfectly still, listening to the CEO of his company construct a narrative that could destroy him. "What do you mean you don't know where you are?" Claire's voice, tinny and urgent, bled through the receiver. "Were you with someone?" "I woke up in a strange house," Victoria stammered, tears spilling hot down her cheeks. It's a small place. There are children's toys. I don't remember leaving the party. I don't remember how I got here." "Are you hurt?" Claire demanded, the lawyer's instinct instantly kicking into high gear. "Are your clothes intact? Victoria, listen to me very carefully. Lock the door. Find a weapon. I am tracing the landline right now. I am calling the police." "No, wait. Don't call the police yet," Victoria pleaded, her voice cracking. "If William finds out about this, if this gets in the press, he'll use it. He'll take the company. He'll say I'm unstable." "If you have been assaulted, the company does not matter," Claire shouted. "Look around. Give me an address. Find a piece of mail." James closed his eyes, his broad chest rising and falling in a slow, controlled rhythm. The trap had sprung. He was a black man standing in a house with a panicked, disoriented white woman of immense power and wealth. The truth was fragile. Fear was an absolute weapon. If the police arrived right now, the optics alone would result in his immediate termination, perhaps worse. The premium health insurance would vanish. The surgery next Thursday would be canceled. Sarah's heart would fail. He stepped out of the shadows, moving into the living room. Victoria shrieked, dropping the phone. It dangled by its coiled cord, Claire's voice yelling from the earpiece. Victoria backed against the wall, her hands raised defensively, her eyes wide with a primal, terrified recognition. "Stay back!" she gasped, her voice trembling. "Don't come any closer!" James stopped. He maintained a distance of at least 10 feet, his hands open and visible at his sides. His face remained a mask of stoic calm, betraying none of the terror vibrating in his own blood. "Victoria, my name is James. I work in risk analysis on the 4th floor. His voice was slow, deep, meticulously measured to convey zero threat. "You are safe. No one has touched you. You are in my home because you were stranded at the party last night with a broken phone and you could not provide an address. I brought you here to keep you safe." She stared at him, her chest heaving, her eyes darting between him and the front door. You brought me here? Why didn't you leave me? Why didn't you call a cab?" "Because you were unable to stand, and leaving you alone in a public space would have been negligent." He did not move a muscle. "Look at the coffee table." Victoria did not look away from him. She kept her back pressed against the wall, edging slowly toward the sofa. She glanced down. She saw the folded gray clothes. She saw the glass of water. She saw the aspirin. And then she saw the notepad propped against the scattered crayons. She reached out a trembling hand, keeping her eyes locked on James, and picked up the paper. She read the steady block handwriting. "For your safety, I am sleeping in my daughter's room. If you need anything, knock." The words blurred. The sheer, overwhelming panic began to recede, leaving behind a cold, hollow wave of confusion. "I don't understand," she whispered. Before James could respond, a small voice broke the tension. "Daddy?" Victoria flinched, spinning toward the hallway. Sarah stood in the corridor wearing pink pajamas adorned with astronauts. She rubbed her eyes sleepily, her stuffed bear dangling from one hand. She looked at James, then turned her gaze to the strange woman standing against the living room wall. James felt a protective surge so powerful it physically hurt. "I'm right here, sweetie. Did we wake you?" Sarah walked slowly into the room, her bare feet padding softly on the rug. She stopped a few feet from Victoria, tilting her head, observing the CEO with the intense, unfiltered scrutiny unique to children. She noticed the wrinkled suit, the smeared makeup, the trembling hands. "Are you okay?" Sarah asked, her voice high and clear. Victoria stared at the little girl, entirely disarmed. Yes, I'm okay." Sarah squinted, stepping slightly closer. She studied Victoria's face with forensic precision. "You don't look okay. You look like you're going to cry." Sarah paused, her brow furrowing in a moment of profound realization. She looked back at James, a gap-toothed smile suddenly breaking across her face. "Daddy, is this the lady who never smiles?" The room went absolutely silent. Victoria's breath hitched. She looked at James, a sudden sharp heat rising in her cheeks. James offered a small, apologetic grimace, his posture finally relaxing a fraction. "Sarah, it is impolite to point out everything we discuss." "But you said she's just sad because she has a big job and no one to share her snacks with," Sarah stated factually, turning back to Victoria. "My daddy says people who don't smile just forgot how, and sometimes they need to sit in the quiet for a while." "Do you want to sit in the quiet?" "I have to be quiet a lot because my heart has a squeak." The absolute innocence of the statement, the casual mention of a defective heart, shattered the final remnants of Victoria's armor. The executive, the woman who commanded thousands of employees and dismantled corporate rivals with ruthless efficiency, felt her throat close. She looked around the room again, truly looked. She saw the framed artwork on the walls, finger paintings and crayon drawings of a family of 3. She saw the small scuffed shoes by the door. She saw the deep, permanent exhaustion etched into the corners of James's eyes, an exhaustion masked by an unyielding backbone of decency. And then she saw the mantel. A simple wooden frame held a photograph of James holding Sarah as a toddler. Beside them stood a woman with bright, laughing eyes, a silk scarf wrapped around a head bald from chemotherapy. The joy in the picture was radiant, defiant, and entirely heartbreaking. Victoria looked down at the phone dangling from the cord, Claire's voice still faintly buzzing. She slowly picked up the receiver. "Claire." Victoria's voice was different now. The panic was gone, replaced by a low, vibrating shame. "Cancel everything. Do not call anyone. I am safe. I made a mistake." She hung up the phone without waiting for a reply. She turned back to James. He stood exactly where he had been, a quiet sentinel, offering no judgment, demanding no gratitude. He had risked everything, his career, his reputation, his daughter's medical lifeline, to protect a woman who had spent the last 2 years treating him like a line item on a budget spreadsheet. "I called my lawyer." The words felt heavy, difficult to force past her lips. I almost told her something terrible happened because I was scared." Fear makes us blind to the reality in front of us. James held her gaze without wavering. It is human to panic, but the reality is you are safe here. Victoria looked down at her hands. You slept on the floor. My daughter has a comfortable rug. You missed her bedtime. I will make it up to her. Victoria felt a tear break free, tracking hotly down her cheek. She wiped it away furiously, a gesture of deeply ingrained corporate conditioning. She was not allowed to show weakness. But the man standing in front of her possessed a strength she had never encountered in the boardrooms of Chicago. It was not the strength of leverage or wealth. It was the strength of absolute moral clarity. "Why?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Why did you help me? You know what people would say. You know the risk you took bringing me here. If William finds out..." "William is not in this room." James took a step forward, closing the distance just enough to command the space without crowding her. He looked her directly in the eyes. "I do not base my actions on the malicious interpretations of broken men. I saw a person who needed help. I have dignity, I deserve respect, and I require myself to act in a way that warrants that respect. Leaving you there would have compromised my own humanity." He turned to Sarah, extending a hand. "Come here, little bird, let's get some breakfast started." Sarah skipped over, taking her father's hand. She looked back at Victoria. "Are you going to stay for pancakes? Daddy makes them in the shape of dinosaurs. Even the sad ones taste good." Victoria swallowed hard, the sharp edges of her corporate persona dissolving into the warm, cinnamon-scented air of the small house. "No, sweetheart, I need to go home. But thank you." James looked at her. "I will call a car service. It will be here in 10 minutes. He turned and walked into the kitchen with his daughter, leaving Victoria standing in the living room. She picked up the folded gray sweatpants and the oversized shirt. She held them to her chest, a sudden, overwhelming wave of gratitude crashing over her. She had built her entire life on the premise that power was the only shield against pain. But this man, possessing a fraction of her wealth and carrying a burden heavier than she could comprehend, was the most powerful person she had ever met. The frost on the windows of the apartment dissolved into weeping trails of condensation as Monday morning broke over Chicago. James stood at the narrow kitchen counter, the harsh fluorescent overhead light casting deep, exhausted shadows under his eyes. His hands, large and calloused from a lifetime of quietly carrying burdens, moved with surgical precision over a grid of amber plastic pill bottles. The digital clock on the microwave glowed a neon green 5:15 a.m. The house was submerged in the heavy, fragile silence that only exists in homes where illness dictates the rhythm of breathing. He carefully split a small, pale blue tablet in half using a razor blade, the metallic scrape loud in the stillness. This was the beta blocker, the chemical tether keeping the erratic flutter of Sarah's left ventricle from spiraling into a fatal rhythm. He swept the halved pill into a small paper cup, followed by the diuretic and the potassium supplement. Each pill was a physical manifestation of his employment at Harrison Financial. The premium insurance tier was the invisible shield wrapping around his home, a shield forged entirely by his ability to remain invisible, competent, and utterly beyond reproach in the corporate machine. He walked down the narrow hallway, the floorboards groaning a familiar, muted protest under his weight. He pushed open the door to Sarah's room. The air inside was warm, smelling faintly of lavender lotion and the ozone tang of the small oxygen concentrator humming in the corner. Sarah was curled beneath her heavy quilt, her small chest rising and falling in a shallow, labored cadence. Her skin held a translucent porcelain quality that always made his heart seize with a terror he could never show. He knelt beside the bed, resting a heavy hand gently on her shoulder. The contact was an anchor. "Little bird, time to wake up. The sun is trying to peek through the clouds." Sarah shifted, her eyelids fluttering open, her dark eyes so painfully reminiscent of Elena's. Focused slowly on his face, she offered a small, crooked smile that didn't quite reach the hollows of her cheeks. She pushed herself up against the pillows, her breathing immediately catching, a soft wheeze rattling in her throat. My chest feels tight today, Daddy, like an elephant is sitting on it. James kept his expression completely neutral, masking the spike of pure adrenaline flooding his system. He reached for the pulse oximeter on the nightstand, clipping the plastic sensor onto her small index finger. The red numbers flashed, fluctuating wildly before settling at 92%. Too low. The valve was failing faster than the doctors had predicted. The elephant is just heavy because it's cold outside. Drink your medicine and the medicine will chase the elephant away. He held the small paper cup to her lips, offering a glass of water as she swallowed the bitter cocktail. He smoothed the hair back from her forehead, his thumb tracing the faint blue veins at her temple. Every second he spent looking at her was a reminder of the absolute necessity of his endurance. He could endure anything the world threw at him, any humiliation, any exhaustion, as long as this little girl drew breath. Martha will be here in 20 minutes. You are going to paint today. You promised me a picture of a dinosaur riding a rocket ship. Sarah giggled, the sound weak but genuine. Dinosaurs don't like space, they get dizzy. Then you will have to paint him a very nice helmet. He kissed her forehead, the heat of her skin lingering on his lips as he stood. He walked to the front door, pulling on his heavy wool overcoat. The fabric was worn at the cuffs, a silent testament to years of prioritizing medical deductibles over personal comfort. He stepped out into the freezing Chicago dawn, the wind coming off the lake cutting through his clothes like a physical blade. He walked the 4 blocks to the L train station, his head down, his posture rigid. The transition had begun. He was leaving the sanctuary of his fatherhood and entering the arena. The commute was a blur of swaying train cars and the collective exhausted silence of the working class. Heading into the gleaming towers of the financial district, James stepped off the train, joining the river of dark coats flowing toward the glass and steel monolith of Harrison Financial. He swiped his badge at the security turnstile, the electronic beep signaling his entry into a world where he was fundamentally an outsider. He stepped into the elevator, pressing the button for the 14th floor. The risk analysis department was a labyrinth of beige cubicles and humming servers, a place designed for human calculators to process the gambles of men who lived 50 floors above them. As the elevator ascended, James felt a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the atmosphere. When the doors parted, the usual low hum of morning chatter was absent. The floor was quiet, too quiet. As he walked down the main aisle toward his desk, heads bowed over keyboards a fraction of a second too late. Eyes darted toward him and immediately snapped away. The air was thick with the distinct metallic taste of corporate blood in the water. He kept his pace even, his face an impassive mask. He rounded the corner to his cubicle. Resting precisely in the center of his keyboard was a plain, unmarked manila envelope. James stopped, his instincts honed by years of navigating a world eager to find a reason to discard him, screamed a warning. He did not look around to see who was watching. He knew they all were. He set his briefcase down, pulling out his chair with deliberate slowness. He sat. He stared at the envelope. It was not routed through internal mail. It had been placed there by hand. He reached out, his fingers sliding under the unsealed flap. He pulled out a single sheet of glossy photographic paper. The image was grainy, shot from a distance in low light, but the subjects were unmistakable. It was James, his arm wrapped firmly around Victoria's waist, guiding her up the concrete steps to his front porch. Victoria's head was thrown back, her hair wild, her posture clearly lacking any physical control. The angle of the photograph was devastatingly precise. It was taken from across the street, partially obscured by the branches of an oak tree, isolating the two figures in a way that stripped away all context. It did not show a man helping a stranded woman. It showed a black subordinate pulling an incapacitated, wealthy white female executive into his home in the dead of night. James stared at the photograph, his pulse roaring in his ears. The chill of the winter morning vanished, replaced by a suffocating heat. This was not a neighbor with a smartphone. The composition, the telephoto compression, the deliberate framing. This was a professional surveillance operation. Someone had been watching the house. Or, more accurately, someone had been watching Victoria, and he had simply walked into the crosshairs. He turned the photograph over. Printed in neat mechanical font on a white adhesive label was a single sentence. Intent does not erase optics. He slipped the photograph back into the envelope, his movements incredibly slow, fighting the violent tremor threatening to take over his hands. The trap had not just been set, it had already closed around his throat. He looked up, his eyes scanning the rows of cubicles. No one was looking at him. Everyone was looking at their screens, the silence absolute and condemning. The rumor mill had already processed the image. The narrative had been written without his participation. 50 floors above, in a penthouse suite overlooking the sprawling grid of the city, Victoria stood by floor-to-ceiling windows. The glass was cold against her forehead. She held a mug of black coffee, the steam rising in thin, twisting ribbons. She was entirely alone. The weekend had been a grueling descent into the reality of her own frailty. She had spent Saturday locked in her apartment, ignoring the frantic calls from her attorney, staring at the neatly folded gray sweatpants resting on her pristine white duvet cover. Those clothes were an artifact of her absolute ruin, and simultaneously, the only evidence of true grace she had experienced in years. She turned away from the window, her bare feet sinking into the plush carpet. Her husband, soon-to-be ex-husband, William, was systematically dismantling her life. He had frozen the discretionary accounts. He had planted whispers of instability with the board of directors. He had orchestrated a psychological siege designed to make her crack publicly. And on Friday night, she had given him exactly what he wanted. She had shattered, but the final blow had not landed, because a man named James, a man whose last name she had to look up in the corporate directory on Sunday morning, had stepped in front of the blade. She walked to her mahogany desk, opening her laptop. She had pulled James's personnel file. James Sterling, senior risk analyst, 14 years with the company, spotless record, 0 disciplinary actions, widowed, 1 dependent. She stared at the digital photograph in the file. It was the face of a man who understood the brutal arithmetic of the world. A man who knew exactly what it would cost him if he was found with the intoxicated CEO in his home. He knew the history of this country, knew the lethal assumptions that would be made instantly and without trial, and he had opened his door anyway. Integrity is the only currency that does not depreciate in the dark. The thought echoed in the silent penthouse, a profound realization that made her sprawling wealth feel suddenly deeply inadequate. She had spent her career building armor, accumulating leverage, believing that invulnerability was the only path to survival. James had shown her that true power lay in the willingness to be vulnerable for the sake of another. Her desk phone rang. The sharp, jarring sound shattered the stillness. She looked at the caller ID, William. She let it ring. She watched the red light flash, a rhythmic pulse of hostility. She would not hide anymore. She would not let fear dictate her movements. She reached for her suit jacket, the armor going back on, but the woman underneath had fundamentally changed. Back on the 14th floor, the manila envelope burned like a radioactive isotope in James's desk drawer. He had spent the morning working with mechanical focus, running risk models, analyzing market volatility, refusing to give the watching floor any sign of panic. He was a master of compartmentalization. He had to be. At exactly 1:14 p.m., his desk phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen. Chicago Memorial Hospital. The carefully constructed walls of his composure instantly cracked. He snatched the receiver, pressing it hard against his ear. James Sterling. Mr. Sterling, this is Dr. Aris's office calling. The voice was different this time, stripping away the bureaucratic pleasantries. This was the clinical coordinator. We have the results of Sarah's morning echocardiogram. James stopped breathing. The background noise of the office, the clicking keyboards, the muted conversations, faded into a distant underwater hum. The mitral valve regurgitation has accelerated significantly over the weekend. The pressure in the pulmonary veins is critical. She is entering the early stages of heart failure. The words were physical blows, driving the air from his lungs. What does that mean for the timeline? It means we cannot wait until next Thursday. We are bumping her to priority surgical status. We have an operating room reserved for tomorrow morning at 6 a.m. You need to bring her in tonight for pre-op admission. Tomorrow. The ground beneath James opened up, a terrifying abyss of immediate life-or-death logistics. I understand. We will be there tonight. Mr. Sterling, there is one more thing. The coordinator's voice dropped, taking on an apologetic, strained tone. The hospital administration requires a final verification of insurance authorization for priority trauma slots. Because the cost of the emergency bypass machine and the surgical team exceeds standard limits, we need your HR department to fax a direct confirmation of your active employment status by 5 p.m. today. Without that fax, the system physically will not allow us to admit her for the surgical suite. James stared blindly at the beige fabric of his cubicle wall. The trap was absolute. I will get you the fax. He hung up the phone. His hand remained on the receiver, his knuckles white, the tendons in his wrist standing out in sharp relief. He opened the desk drawer and looked at the manila envelope. The photograph was not a warning. It was leverage. Whoever sent it knew exactly what they were holding. They held the power to terminate him today. If he was terminated today, the insurance vanished. If the insurance vanished, the fax would not be sent. If the fax was not sent, his daughter would die. It was a perfectly engineered nightmare. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the plastic floor mat. He didn't care who was watching anymore. He grabbed his coat. He had to get the authorization form to HR immediately. He had to secure the paperwork before the axe fell. He power-walked toward the elevator banks, his heart hammering a frantic, desperate rhythm against his ribs. He pressed the button for the 50th floor. HR and executive management shared the summit of the tower. The elevator doors slid open, revealing a lobby of hushed marble and brushed steel. Behind the vast reception desk, a woman in a headset looked up, her professional smile faltering slightly as she registered his presence. Can I help you, Mr. Sterling? She knew his name. A receptionist on the 50th floor did not know the names of 14th floor analysts unless those names were currently a subject of intense, upper-level scrutiny. I need to drop off an emergency medical authorization form for HR to fax to Chicago Memorial. He pulled the document from his breast pocket, his voice carrying a heavy, undeniable authority. Before the receptionist could reach for the paper, a set of heavy mahogany doors down the corridor swung open. William stepped out. He was a man constructed entirely of sharp angles and expensive tailoring. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, his smile a thin, bloodless slash across his face. He possessed the predatory stillness of a man who enjoyed watching things bleed. He saw James at the desk and paused, his eyes gleaming with a sudden dark amusement. Mr. Sterling! William's voice rolled across the marble lobby, smooth and perfectly modulated. What remarkable timing. I was just asking HR to prepare a file on you. Please step into my office. We have an urgent matter of corporate integrity to discuss. James looked at the medical form in his hand. He looked at the receptionist, whose eyes were fixed firmly on her keyboard. He looked at William. The reality of the situation locked into place with the terrifying finality of a prison door slamming shut. The architect of the nightmare was standing right in front of him. James did not flinch. He did not show fear. He placed the medical form gently on the receptionist's desk, tapping it once with his index finger. Fax that immediately. It is a matter of life and death. He turned and walked toward William. He did not walk like a subordinate reporting to an executive. He walked like a man marching toward a firing squad with his eyes wide open. He stepped past William, entering the cavernous corner office. The room was a monument to power. Unobstructed views of Lake Michigan, dark leather furniture, a massive mahogany desk free of any actual work. It was a room designed to make visitors feel small, insignificant, entirely at the mercy of the man who sat behind the desk. William closed the door, the heavy wood muting the sounds of the outer office completely. He walked around James, not offering a seat, moving to the window to look out over the city. "You are a quiet man, James. I appreciate quiet men. They understand the mechanics of the machine. They don't ask questions. They do the work." William turned, leaning back against the glass. But sometimes quiet men find themselves in situations that exceed their pay grade. James remained standing in the center of the room, his posture impeccable. "State your business." William smiled, a genuine expression of predatory delight. He walked to his desk, opening a leather folder. He pulled out a glossy photograph and slid it across the polished wood. It was the same photograph from James's desk, the telephoto shot of James and Victoria on the porch. "I received this rather disturbing image this morning," William said, his voice dripping with faux concern. "An anonymous submission to the board. It appears to show a senior risk analyst taking physical advantage of an inebriated chief executive officer, transporting her to an undisclosed private location, a working-class neighborhood, far away from any witnesses." James stared at the photograph. He did not defend himself. He did not explain. He knew that explanations were the currency of the guilty. "The optics are catastrophic," William continued, pacing slowly behind the desk. "A black man, a white female CEO. Intoxication, a private residence. If this were to leak to the press, the stock would plummet. The board would be forced to take immediate, highly visible action to protect the company's reputation. That action invariably would begin with your immediate termination for gross misconduct, followed likely by criminal charges." The silence in the room stretched, thick and suffocating. "What do you want?" James asked, his voice a low, steady rumble. William stopped pacing. He rested his hands on the back of his leather chair. "I want to protect this company. Victoria has become unstable. Her drinking is out of control. Her judgment is compromised. She is a liability, but the board is hesitant to remove a female CEO without cause. It looks bad for the diversity metrics." William reached into the folder again, pulling out 2 pieces of paper. He laid them side by side on the desk. The first was a pre-drafted HR complaint. "This is a formal grievance. It states that on the night of the executive mixer, Victoria leveraged her position of authority to coerce you into taking her to your home. It states that she made inappropriate advances, created a hostile environment, and threatened your employment if you did not comply." William tapped the paper. "It provides the board with the exact ammunition they need to force her immediate resignation with cause. Clean, efficient, necessary." He tapped the second piece of paper. It was a check, drawn on a private account. The payee line was blank. The amount was $100,000. "You sign the grievance, James. You become the brave whistleblower who exposes a toxic executive. In return, the board is deeply grateful. You receive an immediate promotion to Director of Risk Assessment. And this check, a quiet, off-the-books token of my personal appreciation for your loyalty to the institution, clears today." William leaned forward, his eyes locking onto James's face. He played his final, most devastating card. "I understand your daughter is unwell. I understand she requires a very expensive surgical procedure tomorrow morning. A procedure that requires the very insurance authorization sitting on my receptionist's desk. If you do not sign this grievance, I will fire you right now, in this room. You will be escorted out by security. Your insurance will be terminated retroactively to 8 a.m. Your daughter will not get her surgery." The air in the room turned to ash in James's lungs. The cruelty was absolute. It was a perfectly executed checkmate, leveraging the life of a child against the destruction of an innocent woman. William was offering him a choice between murder and assassination. Kill his daughter's chance at life, or assassinate the character of a woman who had done nothing but break down in a moment of despair. James looked at the check, $100,000. It was enough to cover the surgery out of pocket. It was enough to secure Sarah's future. It was the price of his soul neatly printed on watermarked paper. He closed his eyes. The world fell away. He was no longer in the mahogany office. He was back in the sterile hospital room 3 years ago, holding Elena's hand as the monitors flatlined. He remembered the promise he made to her as the warmth left her fingers. I will raise her in the light. I will show her what a good man is. We do not buy our children's futures with the shattered pieces of our own souls. James opened his eyes. He looked at William. The fear was gone. The panic was gone. What remained was a bedrock of absolute, unyielding moral clarity. It was a dignity so profound it made the opulent office feel cheap. No. William blinked, his arrogant smile faltering for a fraction of a second. I'm sorry, I don't think you understand the mathematics of this situation, Mr. Sterling. This is not a negotiation. You have no leverage. You sign the paper or your daughter dies. James stepped forward, closing the distance to the desk. He towered over the polished wood, his presence suddenly filling the massive room, an immovable object meeting a corrupt force. I understand the mathematics perfectly. James's voice was the sound of a glacier shifting, low, heavy, and completely unstoppable. You are asking me to bear false witness against a woman whose only crime was experiencing pain in public. You are asking me to weaponize my race, my gender, and my position to execute your corporate coup. You are using the failing heart of a 7-year-old girl as leverage to steal a company. William's face darkened, the blood rising to his cheeks. I am giving you a way to save her, you idiot. Take the money. I have dignity. I deserve respect. James did not raise his voice, but the words struck like physical blows. And because I demand respect for myself, I cannot strip it from another human being. I will not teach my daughter to survive by trampling on the truth. I will not pay for her healing with blood money. Keep your check. Keep your promotion. William stared at him, genuinely shocked. He had built his entire worldview on the premise that every man had a price, that morality was a luxury of the rich and a vulnerability of the poor. He was looking at a man who was entirely immune to his power. You are a fool, William spat, his voice trembling with sudden rage. You are a dead man walking. I will ruin you. I will make sure you never work in this sector again. I will call security right now. Call them. James did not move back. He stood his ground, a monument to integrity in a cathedral of lies. Fire me. Terminate the insurance, but know this. Power is loud, but truth only requires a whisper. And when the whisper starts, your money will not protect you. James turned his back on the executive. He walked toward the heavy mahogany doors, his stride unbroken, his head held high. He opened the door and stepped out into the lobby. The receptionist was staring at her computer screen, her face pale. James pointed to the medical authorization form still sitting on her desk. Did you fax it? She swallowed hard, nodding slowly. Yes, Mr. Sterling, 5 minutes ago. It went through. A microscopic fraction of the weight lifted from his chest. The hospital had the authorization. They had a window. It might only be a few hours before William's termination order cascaded through the system. But the paperwork was in the hospital's hands. The surgery was locked in the system. They would fight the billing later. Right now, he had to get to his daughter. He walked to the elevators. He didn't return to the 14th floor. He didn't pack his desk. He rode the elevator down to the lobby, walking out through the revolving glass doors into the biting Chicago wind. He had just detonated his career. He had stepped off a financial cliff. But as the freezing air hit his face, he felt a strange, profound sense of peace. He was a free man. The afternoon dissolved into a frantic blur of logistics. James rushed home, packed a small duffel bag with Sarah's pajamas, her favorite stuffed bear, and a stack of coloring books. Martha helped him load the car, her eyes heavy with unspoken worry. They arrived at Chicago Memorial just as the winter sun began to set, painting the hospital windows in bruised shades of violet and orange. The pediatric cardiology wing was a world of hushed voices, beeping monitors, and the pervasive smell of antiseptic. Sarah was admitted immediately. The nurses, sensing the escalating urgency in her chart, moved with practiced efficiency. They changed her into a faded hospital gown, connecting her to a terrifying array of monitors and IV lines. Sarah watched the activity with wide, frightened eyes, her small hand gripping James's thumb with astonishing strength. "Daddy, the wires are cold," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. "I know, little bird, but these wires are magic. They are going to tell the doctors exactly how to fix the squeak in your heart." He sat on the edge of the narrow bed, leaning over so his face filled her field of vision, blocking out the sterile room. He had to be her entire world right now. He had to absorb her fear. By 8 p.m., the ward settled into the quiet routine of the night shift. The overhead lights were dimmed. Sarah was exhausted, the pre-op medications making her eyelids heavy. But her anxiety fought the sedatives. She tossed restlessly against the stiff pillows. "Daddy, read me the story about the night." James reached into the duffel bag, pulling out a worn hardcover book. The spine was taped together, the pages soft from years of use. It was Elena's favorite book to read to her. He cleared his throat, pushing down the exhaustion that threatened to crack his voice. He began to read. He didn't just read the words, he performed them. He brought the dragons to life. He made the swords clash. He filled the small, terrifying hospital room with a world of courage and triumph. He poured every ounce of his remaining strength into the cadence of his voice, building a fortress of words around his fragile child. Outside the door, in the dimly lit hallway, Victoria stood completely still. She had not gone back to the office after the weekend. She had spent the day meeting with her attorney, quietly gathering the financial documents she would need for the coming war with William. But as the sun set, a restless, unshakable urge had taken hold of her. She needed to see the man who had saved her. She needed to return the gray sweatpants, washed and folded, an excuse to stand in his presence and perhaps absorb some of the quiet strength she so desperately needed. She had driven to his house, only to find it dark. A neighbor, seeing her standing on the porch, had mentioned seeing James rushing out with a hospital bag. It had taken her an hour to track down the admission through the hospital network, utilizing the executive privileges she still barely clung to. Now, she stood outside room 312. The door was cracked open a few inches. She looked through the narrow gap. She saw the monitors. She saw the IV poles. She saw the tiny, frail girl lost in the center of the bed, and she saw James. He was leaning over the bed, holding a battered book, his deep voice carrying a soothing, rhythmic melody that seemed to push back the darkness of the room. He was a man who had everything to lose, a man who she knew with absolute certainty was currently existing in a state of sheer terror for his child's life. Yet there was no panic in him. There was only devotion, pure, unadulterated, sacrificing devotion. Victoria watched as Sarah's eyes finally fluttered, clented, her breathing evening out into a slow, shallow rhythm. James stopped reading. He didn't move away. He gently rested his forehead against the mattress near his daughter's hand, his broad shoulders rising and falling in a silent, solitary vigil. A physical ache blossomed in Victoria's chest. She had spent her entire life chasing an illusion of security. She had married William for power. She had climbed the corporate ladder for control. She had accumulated wealth to build a wall between herself and the world. But looking into this sterile hospital room, she realized she had nothing. She was fundamentally impoverished. She had no one in the world who would sit by her bed and read to her in the dark. She had no one who would risk their own survival to ensure hers. James had that. Despite the brutal hand the world had dealt him, he was the wealthiest man she had ever seen. She pushed the door open, the hinges screaming a tiny metallic protest. James's head snapped up. his body instantly tensing, assuming a defensive posture between the door and the bed. When he saw Victoria standing in the threshold holding a paper shopping bag, his expression shifted from defensive to a profound, weary confusion. "Victoria." He kept his voice to a bare whisper. "What are you doing here?" She stepped into the room, the scent of expensive perfume immediately clashing with the rubbing alcohol and iodine. She looked entirely out of place in her designer trench coat, her sharp features softened by the dim light and the undeniable sorrow in her eyes. "I went to your house to return the clothes." She held up the bag slightly. "Your neighbor said you were here. I needed to know if you were all right." James stood up slowly, his joints popping. He gestured toward the small plastic visitor's chair in the corner of the room. He moved away from the bed, ensuring their conversation would not wake Sarah. Victoria sat down, her coat rustling loud in the quiet room. She looked at the monitors, watching the jagged green line of Sarah's heartbeat. "Is she?" Victoria couldn't finish the sentence. The reality of a dying child was too massive, too terrifying to articulate. "Her valve is failing," James stated, the clinical detachment the only way he could speak the words without breaking. "They are operating at dawn. It is a high-risk procedure, but she is a fighter, like her mother." Victoria looked at him, truly seeing the devastating toll the last 48 hours had taken on him. The dark circles under his eyes looked like bruises. His posture, usually so rigid and impeccable, was slightly bowed under the crushing weight of the impending dawn. "James," Victoria's voice was trembling. "William called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow afternoon. He sent an encrypted email to the executive committee. He said he has acquired evidence of severe misconduct. He is making his move to oust me." James did not look surprised. He simply nodded, his eyes remaining fixed on his sleeping daughter. "I know. I met with him this morning." Victoria's breath caught. "You met with him? Why?" "He intercepted me when I was delivering the emergency insurance authorization for this surgery." James turned his head, his dark eyes locking onto hers. The absolute clarity in his gaze pinned her to the chair. "He showed me the photograph, the one taken of us on my porch. He had a professional surveilling you." Victoria felt the blood drain from her face. A cold, nauseating horror washed over her. William had weaponized her lowest moment. He had captured her vulnerability and turned it into a blade. He has a picture?" she whispered, her hands gripping the arms of the plastic chair. "What did he say? What did he do?" "He offered me a choice." James's voice remained completely level, devoid of anger or accusation. It was the delivery of pure, unvarnished truth. "He offered me $100,000 and a promotion to director. In exchange, he required me to sign a formal HR grievance stating that you sexually harassed me, that you leveraged your position to coerce me into taking you to my home, and that you created a hostile work environment." Victoria stopped breathing. The sheer sociopathic cruelty of the plan paralyzed her. William was going to use the racial and gender dynamics of the situation to create a scandal so explosive the board would have no choice but to terminate her immediately to save the stock price, and he was going to use James as the detonator. "And if you refused?" she asked, dread pooling in her stomach. James looked back at Sarah. He watched the rise and fall of her chest under the thin blanket. "He threatened to fire me on the spot. He threatened to retroactively cancel my health insurance." James paused, the silence in the room suddenly deafening. "He threatened to cancel the authorization for the surgery tomorrow morning." Victoria clapped a hand over her mouth, a physical reaction to the sheer brutality of the extortion. William had put a price tag on a child's life. He had handed James a loaded gun and told him to shoot her or watch his daughter die. She looked at James, her mind reeling. He was sitting here, in the hospital room. The surgery was happening. That meant the insurance was active. That meant— "You signed it," Victoria whispered, the words tasting like ash. You took the money. You signed the grievance. She didn't blame him. She couldn't. If she were in his position, staring at the failing heart of her own child, she would have burned the entire world down to save them. She would have signed 1,000 grievances. She felt a profound, devastating resignation. It was over. William had won. James turned his head slowly. He looked at her, his expression a mixture of profound exhaustion and a quiet, unyielding You can rebuild a career from ash, but you cannot wash the stain of a bought conscience. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped tightly together. I told him no. Victoria froze. Her brain refused to process the words. What? I refused the money. I refused the promotion. I refused to sign a lie. James's voice grew deeper, vibrating with a fierce, terrifying integrity. I told him I have dignity. I told him I deserve respect. And I told him I would not teach my daughter to survive by trampling on the truth of another human being. But the insurance, Victoria stammered, pointing a shaking finger toward the bed. The surgery. How? The authorization was faxed 5 minutes before he threatened to fire me. The hospital has it. It is in the system. James let out a long, slow breath. He will undoubtedly terminate my employment in the morning. He will likely try to claw back the coverage. We will have a monumental legal and financial battle ahead of us. We will lose the house. We will lose everything. He looked at Sarah, a gentle, heartbreaking smile touching the corners of his mouth. But I will be able to look her in the eye when she wakes up. I will be able to tell her that her father is an honorable man, and that is the only inheritance that matters. Victoria stared at him, tears welling in her eyes and spilling silently down her cheeks. She was looking at a moral giant, a man who had looked into the abyss of his worst nightmare, who had been offered a lifeline coated in poison and had chosen to fall rather than compromise his soul. He had not just saved her on Friday night from a public humiliation. He had just saved her life, her reputation, her entire legacy, at the cost of his own financial survival. James, she whispered, her voice breaking completely. You threw your life away for me, a woman who didn't even know your last name 3 days ago. I did not do it for you. James looked at her, his gaze steady and unflinching. I did it for me. I did it because participating in your destruction would have destroyed the man my wife asked me to be. Victoria stood up. Her legs were shaking, but a new, profound fire had ignited in her chest. The armor of the Ice Queen was gone, melted away by the sheer, terrifying heat of true human decency. In its place, something harder, sharper, and far more dangerous was forming. William thought he had won. He thought he had cornered a desperate man and broken him. He had calculated every variable except the one that mattered most, character. He called a board meeting for tomorrow at 2 o'clock, Victoria said, her voice dropping, the tremor taking on the cold, precise edge of a blade being drawn from a sheath. He is going to present the photograph. He is going to try to fire you publicly to establish the narrative of my incompetence, and then he will demand my resignation. Then let him try. James stood up, facing her. He was no longer a subordinate. He was an equal. I will not hide. I will not run. If he wants to destroy me, he will have to look me in the eye and do it in the light. Victoria looked at the sleeping child, then back to the father who was willing to lose the world to keep his soul intact. No, Victoria said, her eyes flashing with a predatory brilliance that William had long forgotten she possessed. He isn't going to destroy you, James. He isn't going to touch your insurance. He isn't going to touch your house. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her new phone. You stood up for me when I was too weak to stand. Tomorrow I am going to stand for you. She looked at the digital clock on the wall. It was nearly midnight. Stay with your daughter. Win the battle in this room tomorrow morning. I am going to go prepare the battlefield for tomorrow afternoon. She turned and walked out of the room, leaving the shopping bag containing the folded gray sweatpants on the chair. It was a silent promise, a debt acknowledged, a war declared. James watched her go. He turned back to the bed, listening to the rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat of the monitor. The terrifying dawn was approaching. The knives were drawn. But as he sat back down and took his daughter's fragile hand in his own, he knew he had already won the only victory that truly mattered. The surgical waiting room on the 5th floor of Chicago Memorial smelled of stale coffee and industrial bleach, a sterile purgatory suspended above the waking city. James sat perfectly rigid in a molded plastic chair, his large hands clasped between his knees, his knuckles bone white. Beyond the heavy double doors, a team of surgeons had his daughter's chest open. They had stopped her failing heart. They were relying on the machine to pump blood through her tiny veins, while they frantically tried to repair the defective valve. The wall clock ticked with a heavy metallic finality. 6:42 in the morning. Outside the frosted windows, the sun struggled to pierce the dense gray cloud cover rolling off Lake Michigan. The winter light offered no warmth, only a pale illumination of the snow-dusted rooftops. James tracked the passage of time by the subtle shifts in the shadows stretching across the linoleum floor. Every passing minute was an agonizing weight pressing down on his chest. He closed his eyes, visualizing the steady rhythm of a healthy heartbeat, trying to manifest the rhythm into existence through sheer force of will. He thought about the insurance authorization. He thought about the $100,000 check resting on the polished mahogany desk 50 floors above the city. The choice he had made the previous afternoon carried a terrifying gravity. He had secured the financial lifeline required for the surgeons to operate, but the retaliation was inevitable. By the end of this business day, he would be unemployed. He would be blacklisted. The medical bills extending beyond the immediate surgery would crush him. The small brick house would be foreclosed. The future was a collapsing tunnel, narrowing to a dark, suffocating point. A man cannot navigate a storm by looking at the shipwreck. He must look at the compass. His compass was the quiet, steady breathing of his daughter when she was safe. His compass was the promise he made to a dying woman. He opened his eyes, staring at the blank white moon opposite his chair. He had traded his livelihood for his daughter's life and his own soul. It was the only trade a decent man could make. He felt no regret, only a deep, resonant exhaustion, a bone-deep weariness that threatened to pull him under. The heavy double doors swung open, the pneumatic hinges hissing softly. Dr. Eris stepped into the waiting room. He still wore his green surgical scrubs, the fabric stained with dark, unmistakable spots. He pulled the paper cap from his head, running a hand through sweat-dampened hair. The surgeon's face was lined with the profound fatigue of a man who had spent the last 5 hours battling death with his bare hands. James stood. The movement was slow, his joints aching from the hours of rigid tension. He did not speak. The question was too massive to articulate. Dr. Eris offered a small, exhausted smile, the kind of smile that only exists on the far side of a miracle. The valve replacement was successful. The tissue accepted the graft perfectly. We have taken her off the bypass machine. The sterile walls of the waiting room blurred. The harsh fluorescent lights haloed into brilliant white flares. The crushing weight that had sat on James's chest for 7 years finally cracked. Her heart is beating on its own. The rhythm is strong. The pulmonary pressure is already dropping to normal levels. The surgeon stepped closer, resting a heavy, reassuring hand on James's shoulder. She is in recovery. She will be heavily sedated for the next 12 hours, but the crisis has passed. Your daughter is going to live a very long, very healthy life. James closed his eyes. A single hot tear escaped, tracking down the deep lines of his face. He bowed his head, his broad shoulders shaking in a silent, violent release of accumulated terror. He reached out, gripping the surgeon's forearm with a strength that made the other man flinch slightly. "Thank you." The words were a ragged whisper dragged from the deepest part of his chest. Thank you for her life. She fought hard. Dr. Eris squeezed his shoulder in return. She is resting in the pediatric ICU, room 412. You can sit with her. James walked down the long, silent corridor, his boots echoing against the polished floor tiles. He stopped outside the glass walls of the intensive care unit. Sarah lay in the center of the mechanical web, surrounded by monitors that were now flashing a beautiful, steady green rhythm. Her chest rose and fell with a deep, unimpeded ease he had never seen before. The pale, translucent fragility was gone, replaced by the deep, peaceful sleep of a child whose body was no longer fighting a war against itself. He stepped into the room, pulling a chair close to the bed. He took her small, warm hand in his own. The monitors beeped a steady, triumphant song. He sat there for hours, watching the winter sun climb higher in the sky, watching the color slowly return to his daughter's cheeks. He was a man who had lost everything, but sitting in that room, holding that small hand, he possessed the entire world. At noon, the vibration of his phone shattered the sacred silence. He pulled the device from his coat pocket. A calendar alert flashed across the screen. Emergency Board of Directors meeting, Executive Committee, 2 p.m., room 50A. The grace period was over. The corporate machine was mobilizing. William was executing his strike. James looked at his daughter. Her breathing remained steady, a perfect, unbroken rhythm. Martha had arrived an hour earlier, sitting quietly in the corner of the room with a book, offering a silent nod of support. I have to go. James leaned down, pressing his lips to Sarah's forehead. I have a dragon to fight, but I will be back before you wake up. He stood, buttoning his worn wool coat. He walked out of the hospital, stepping into the biting Chicago afternoon. The wind ripped off the lake, tearing through the grid of the city, carrying the scent of exhaust and frozen asphalt. He walked to the L train station, swiping his card, joining the midday transit of anonymous faces. He was not going to run. He was not going to hide in the hospital while William assassinated his character in a locked boardroom. If they were going to strip him of his livelihood, they were going to have to look him in the eye while they did it. He would not allow a lie to stand unchallenged in the dark. The Harrison Financial Building loomed over the plaza, a monolith of black glass and steel reflecting the gray sky. James pushed through the revolving doors, bypassing the standard employee turnstiles. He walked directly to the executive elevators, swiping his badge. The light flashed green. His access had not yet been revoked. The system was waiting for the official decree. The elevator climbed silently, accelerating toward the 50th floor. James checked his reflection in the polished steel doors. His tie was slightly crooked, his coat worn, his eyes carrying the dark shadows of a sleepless, terrifying night. He looked exactly like what he was, a working-class father who had spent his life in the trenches. He did not belong in the boardroom. He did not possess the armor of bespoke suits or inherited wealth. He possessed only himself. The doors parted. The executive lobby was silent, the air thick with an oppressive, engineered calm. 2 security guards stood near the entrance to the main boardroom, their hands resting near their radios. They recognized him immediately. Mr. Sterling. The senior guard stepped forward, blocking the corridor. You are not scheduled for this meeting. You need to return to your floor. My name is on the agenda. James did not slow his pace. He walked directly toward the guards, his physical presence commanding the space. Unless you have a signed termination order from Human Resources, my badge grants me access to this floor. Step aside. The guard hesitated. The absolute, unyielding authority in James's voice bypassed the corporate hierarchy. It was the voice of a man who had already faced death that morning and won. A pair of security guards did not frighten him. The guard stepped back, allowing James to pass. He reached the heavy oak doors of room 50A. He did not knock. He gripped the brass handles and pushed them open. The boardroom was a cavernous space designed to intimidate. A massive table carved from a single slab of walnut dominated the center of the room. 12 men and women sat in high-backed leather chairs, the elite architects of the financial empire. At the head of the table stood William, leaning forward, his hands resting on the polished wood. Behind William, dominating the entire back wall, a massive digital projection screen displayed the photograph. The grainy telephoto image of James with his arm around Victoria on his dark front porch. Isolated, devoid of context, engineered to destroy. The conversation in the room abruptly died. 12 pairs of eyes snapped toward the doors. "Security!" William barked, his face immediately flushing with a dark, violent anger. "Remove this man immediately. I am an employee of this company." James walked into the room, his heavy boots sinking into the thick carpet. He moved past the junior partners, ignoring the gasps of shock. He stopped at the opposite end of the long table, facing William directly. "You called a meeting to discuss my character. I am here to participate." A murmur rippled through the board. A white-haired managing director leaned forward, adjusting his glasses, looking between the photograph on the screen and the man standing at the end of the table. "Mr. Sterling, you are out of line," the director stated, his voice carrying the practiced weight of old money. "This is a closed executive session. You are currently the subject of a severe misconduct investigation regarding the predatory exploitation of our chief executive officer." "There is no investigation." James locked eyes with the director. "An investigation implies a search for truth. This is an execution." William slammed his hand against the table, the sound echoing sharply. "You arrogant fool! You are looking at the evidence on the screen behind me. We have sworn affidavits from neighbors. You took advantage of a highly intoxicated woman. You transported her to an unauthorized location. You compromised the integrity of this institution and the safety of its leadership. You are fired, Mr. Sterling. Security is calling the police as we speak. Call them." James did not flinch. He stood perfectly still, a solitary pillar of defiance in a room designed to crush the weak. "Call the police. Let them audit the surveillance footage of the restaurant. Let them interview the valet who brought my car while 30 executives watched a woman collapse and turned their backs to protect their own careers. Let them look at the dashcam footage from my vehicle." The room grew terrifyingly quiet. The mention of a dashcam caused a visible flinch in several of the board members. "You are throwing smoke," William sneered, attempting to regain control of the narrative. "The optics are indisputable. The stock will hemorrhage if this leaks. You are a predator, and you are finished." A man's worth is not measured by the height of his office, but by the weight of his word. James's voice dropped, the deep resonance filling every corner of the vast room. He looked at the faces of the board members one by one. "You sit in this room and calculate risk. You measure the value of a human life in profit margins and PR statements. You look at that photograph and you see a scandal. I look at that photograph and I see a failure of basic human decency from everyone who was in that penthouse on Friday night." He pointed a thick, calloused finger at the screen. "That woman was abandoned. She was broken, stripped of her phone, unable to stand, and every person in her orbit walked away because helping her was a bad investment. I did not exploit her. I provided sanctuary. I slept on the floor of my child's bedroom so she could lock the door and be safe from the wolves circling her." William let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "Sanctuary? Do you expect the board to believe a 14th floor analyst risked his career out of the goodness of his heart? What did you ask her for the next morning, James? A promotion, a payout?" "I asked her for nothing." James shifted his gaze back to William, his eyes burning with a cold, terrifying fire. "Just as I asked you for nothing yesterday afternoon when you brought me into your office, when you laid a check for $100,000 on your desk and told me you would cancel the insurance paying for my daughter's open-heart surgery if I did not sign a fabricated sexual harassment grievance against her." The boardroom erupted. Several directors stood up, their chairs scraping loudly. Shouts of disbelief and outrage filled the air. The white-haired director slammed his hand on the table, demanding order. William's face drained of color. The arrogant smirk vanished, replaced by a momentary flash of pure panic. That is a slanderous lie. The man is desperate. He is making up stories to save his own skin. Lies require an audience. James did not raise his voice over the shouting. He spoke with the quiet, devastating power of absolute certainty. The truth only requires a witness. The heavy oak doors at the back of the boardroom swung open. The shouting died instantly, cut off as if a physical switch had been thrown. Victoria stepped into the room. She did not wear the slate-gray suit of the Ice Queen. She wore a simple, dark dress, her hair pulled back loosely, her face free of the severe, intimidating makeup she usually employed as armor. She looked pale, exhausted, but her posture was flawless. She possessed a terrifying, quiet gravity that pulled all the oxygen from the room. She walked slowly past the security guards, who immediately stepped back, their eyes lowered. She walked past James, stopping for a fraction of a second to meet his eyes. The look exchanged between them was a silent transmission of profound respect. She walked the length of the walnut table, stopping directly opposite William. "Victoria." William's voice cracked slightly, his mask slipping. "You should not be here. You are unwell. The board is handling this situation to protect you." "You are not protecting me, William. You are hunting me." Victoria looked up at the massive projection screen. She stared at the photograph of herself, vulnerable, intoxicated, leaning on James. She did not look away in shame. She absorbed the image, owning the absolute worst moment of her life in front of the people she commanded. "On Friday night, I suffered a total psychological collapse." Her voice was steady, carrying clearly across the silent room. "I drank until I lost consciousness. I broke my phone. I was entirely incapacitated in a public setting." She turned her gaze to the board members, making eye contact with the men and women who had watched her fall. "And none of you moved. You turned your backs. You calculated the risk of association, and you deemed me a liability." The only person in that room who saw a human being in pain instead of a corporate hazard was James Sterling. She pointed to James, who remained standing at the far end of the table. "He did not exploit me. He saved my life. He took me to his home. He gave me clean clothes, and he gave me the one thing none of you have ever offered: basic, unconditional dignity." William slammed his fist on the table again. "He is manipulating you. You were intoxicated. You cannot rely on your memory of that night. He brought you here to create a scandal, to extort the company. I have the HR grievance drafted and ready. He was going to sign it." Victoria turned back to William. The ice had returned to her eyes, but it was no longer a defensive shield. It was a weapon. "He was going to sign it?" she asked, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Or you were going to force him to sign it?" "He is a liar." William pointed a trembling finger at James. "He invented the extortion story because he knew he was caught." "Say it again." Victoria stepped closer to the head of the table. She leaned forward, placing her hands flat on the polished wood, mirroring William's aggressive posture but holding a vastly superior ground. "Look at me, William, and say it again. Tell the board that you did not offer this man $100,000. Tell the board that you did not threaten to retroactively cancel his health insurance. Tell them you did not use the failing heart of a 7-year-old girl as leverage to force him to commit perjury to steal my company." "I absolutely did not!" William shouted, his composure shattering entirely. "It is a desperate fabrication from a man trying to save his miserable job." Victoria reached into the pocket of her dress. She pulled out a small, sleek digital audio recorder. She set it gently on the walnut table. "True steel is forged in the fire, but it is cooled in the tears of the broken." She pressed the play button. The audio quality was immaculate. The voices echoed through the silent boardroom, clear and devastating. "I understand your daughter is unwell. I understand she requires a very expensive surgical procedure tomorrow morning. You sign the grievance, James. You become the brave whistleblower. In return, an immediate promotion. And this check, clears today. William's voice filled the room, a ghost of his own arrogance returning to destroy him. If you do not sign this grievance, I will fire you right now, in this room. Your insurance will be terminated retroactively. Your daughter will not get her surgery. The recording clicked off. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of an empire collapsing. The board members stared at William with a mixture of horror and profound disgust. The white-haired director slowly took off his glasses, placing them carefully on the table. William, the director's voice was barely a whisper. You are finished. You will surrender your keycard and your company phone to security immediately. You will vacate the premises. The legal department will contact you regarding the immediate dissolution of your shares and the pending criminal extortion charges. William looked around the table. He saw no allies. The predators had turned on him. The blood in the water was his own. He looked at Victoria, his face twisted in a mask of pure hatred. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. The silence of the room was a physical weight pressing him down. He turned and walked toward the doors. He did not look at James as he passed. The two security guards fell in step behind him, escorting the ruined executive out of the tower he had tried to steal. The heavy oak doors clicked shut. Victoria let out a long, slow breath. The tension drained from her shoulders. She looked at the board members. The meeting is adjourned. We have a company to rebuild. She turned and walked toward James. The vast length of the boardroom felt different now. The air was clear. The threat was neutralized. How is Sarah? It was the only question that mattered. The corporation, the stock prices, the boardroom coup, all of it faded into insignificance against the reality of the hospital room. She is breathing on her own. James's voice was thick with emotion, the stoic armor finally cracking, revealing the profound relief underneath. The surgery was a complete success. She is going to live. Victoria closed her eyes, a genuine, radiant smile breaking across her face. It was the smile Sarah had asked for, the smile of a woman who had finally remembered how to feel. I am going to the hospital, James said, stepping away from the table. I need to be there when she wakes up. Go! Victoria stepped aside, clearing his path to the doors. Your job is secure, James. Your insurance is secure. Take all the time you need. James paused at the doors. He looked back at the woman standing in the center of the boardroom. She was no longer the Ice Queen. She was a human being, flawed, vulnerable, and incredibly brave. You fought a good war today, James said quietly. I had a good teacher. She met his gaze, her eyes shining with unshed tears. You taught me that a desk can be replaced, a soul cannot. I don't want to live behind the armor anymore, James. I don't want this to be an act. I want to build something real. You already have. James pushed the doors open and walked back out into the city. The gray clouds were finally breaking, thin shafts of late afternoon sunlight piercing the gloom, illuminating the cold streets with a brilliant golden warmth. 1 year later, the smell of turpentine and acrylic paint filled the sunroom of the small brick house. The winter snow had melted, giving way to the vibrant, chaotic green of a Chicago spring. The large windows were thrown open, letting in the cool breeze off the lake. Sarah stood at a wooden easel, wearing an oversized t-shirt entirely covered in smears of purple and yellow paint. She held a brush with intense concentration, tongue poking out the corner of her mouth as she dragged a streak of cerulean blue across the canvas. She looked entirely different from the frail, translucent ghost in the hospital bed. Her cheeks were full, her eyes bright, her energy boundless. The only physical reminder of the war she had won was the thin, faded scar running down the center of her chest, a badge of absolute courage. James sat in a worn armchair in the corner of the room, a laptop resting on his knees. He was reviewing a risk assessment portfolio. The header on the document read, Office of the Managing Director, Risk Analysis. He wore a comfortable sweater, the dark circles under his eyes completely vanished. The crushing weight of survival had been replaced by the quiet, steady rhythm of a life built on truth and secured by honor. The front doorbell rang. a cheerful chiming sound. Sarah dropped her paintbrush into a jar of water, spinning around with a massive gap-toothed grin. "She's here!" James closed the laptop, setting it on the side table. He stood smiling as his daughter sprinted out of the sunroom, her bare feet slapping against the hardwood floor. He followed her into the hallway, watching as she reached up on her tiptoes to turn the deadbolt. She pulled the door open. Victoria stood on the porch. She was wearing a soft beige trench coat, a bright silk scarf wrapped around her neck. She carried a large bakery box tied with red string. Her face was relaxed, the sharp, calculating edges of the executive completely replaced by the warm, genuine presence of a woman who had found her family. "I brought the dinosaur cookies," Victoria announced, stepping into the house. "Did you get the ones with the extra green frosting?" Sarah demanded, immediately reaching for the box. "I personally supervised the baker." Victoria handed the box over, laughing, as Sarah immediately retreated to the kitchen to inspect the goods. Victoria took off her coat, hanging it on the rack next to James's worn wool overcoat. She turned to him, the afternoon sunlight catching the bright, happy crinkles around her eyes. "The board approved your latest projections," she said, leaning against the wall. "The stock is up. The new Ethical Oversight Committee is functioning perfectly." "I am glad to hear the machine is running smoothly." James stepped closer, reaching out to tuck a stray lock of blonde hair behind her ear. The gesture was simple, intimate, and entirely devoid of fear. "The machine is fine." Victoria looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the quiet, unshakable strength of the man standing in front of her. "But the people are better." From the kitchen, Sarah's voice rang out, loud and full of life. "Daddy, she got the green ones! You have to come eat the head off the T-Rex!" James laughed, a deep, resonant sound that filled the small house. He looked at the photograph on the mantel, Elena smiling, her eyes bright and fierce. He had kept his promise. He had raised their daughter in the light. He had shown her what a good man was, and in doing so, he had brought the light back into the lives of everyone around him. He offered his hand to Victoria. "Come on," he said, his voice warm and steady. "We have a dinosaur to defeat." She took his hand, their fingers intertwining naturally, securely. They walked into the kitchen together, leaving the corporate world far behind them, stepping into the vibrant, chaotic, and profoundly beautiful reality of an earned, honest life.